My name is Stanley Sword. I have the great pleasure to welcome fighting pilot Mandy Hickson from the Royal Air Force. And you were the second woman to fly a Tornado GR4. You did 3 tours of duty and 45 missions over in the Kuwait War. And your life has been a bit like a tornado, and you've flown a tornado. Tell us, what's do you have a relationship with your plane? Is it like when you're a race driver and you have your own car, so to say, your Formula One car?
Oh, I'd like to say so. Actually, well, I was really lucky. I did have my name written on the side of my aeroplane, which was a lovely one. So I did get a lot of photos taken on that day when I had finally got my name on a jet, which was brilliant. But you don't get to fly the same aeroplane all the time. So you would know which ones were more reliable than others, though. And when you saw that you had a certain one, you're like, oh, not that one. That always breaks.
Yeah.
So it was quite
And
fun.
when they were taking out of duty, do you know what happened to it? Have you lost track of your tornado?
I don't know actually. I think my one had probably been repainted because when I was flying it, it was quite a few years ago now. So I think mine had probably already been repainted. In fact, do you know what? I don't even know what my tail fin number was. I should probably look it up and find out what's happened to it.
What's your first memory of flying?
Well, when I was 14, I flew as a young air cadet, and I just remember I came down and I remember quite distinctly saying to my parents, "It's like dancing in the sky." It's just feels like poetry in motion, really. It's a really beautiful. There's nothing I love more than a dreary grey day on the ground, and you take off and then you pop above the clouds, and it is just brilliant blue. And yet, if you were on the ground, it would be a horrible day, and it's not. It's a lovely day above. And so, yeah, the nice thing with flying is that you can normally find the blue sky somewhere.
Mm. And do you ever dream about flying at night?
Yeah, I flew at night a fair amount actually. So yeah, you do a lot of night flying, and one of the things with the Tornado is it has the ability to fly at low level on autopilot at night, which is quite nerve-wracking. Basically, you're hands off. Well, you're following the controls, but you're looking at the ground on a forward-looking infrared, and you're literally contouring the ground as you're going. But the computer is flying the aircraft, and that is quite incredible.
Mm. And your grandfather was a fighting pilot during the Second World War. Uh,
Yeah.
Tell us about your journey into becoming a pilot.
Well, I grew up hearing stories from him, daring and do and all of this side of things. And I think just that by osmosis, you start to just hear the excitement and you start to maybe think, oh, wow, this sounds like quite an exciting job to do. And so when the Air Cadets opened its doors to girls when I was 14, I joined that club. I flew and it fostered a love of the military and of a career potentially in aviation. I then went off to university. I gained my private pilot's license, and they changed the rules for women to be able to fly whilst I was at university. So in 1990, and so in my second year of university, I applied to join the Air Force. I took all the tests. I sadly failed quite a lot of the aptitude tests initially, and then I took them again, and I failed them again. But at the time, women were only just allowed to start to fly, and they couldn't understand why actually predominantly a lot of women were failing the tests, and they realized that maybe they were designed for men, and maybe there was some unconscious bias in there because men and women do process things slightly differently. And so they looked at re-engineering the tests, and we see more equal footing. In the end, I was taken on as a test case to see actually how far I would go, even though I had not got much aptitude as far as these tests were concerned. So I was very lucky that people believed in me. And then throughout my flying training, I had a wonderful team around me, a support network of fantastic gentlemen and not very many women at all, but the occasional woman, which was fantastic. And yeah, and I finally got to fly the Tornado on the front line.
Mm. And where did you do your education? And what is the different parts that it contain of?
So I was educated. I grew up in a place called Manchester. Most people know Manchester United or Manchester City because they know the football teams. And then I went off to university in Birmingham, and I studied a degree that was not relevant to flying at all. Actually, I did a geography and a sports science degree. because I enjoyed those subjects. And you don't have to study certain subjects to be a pilot in the Air Force. In fact, you don't even need a degree. You can stop and go in straight at the age of 18 if you wanted to. And then I joined the Air Force straight after university at 21.
And where was that? Where is it located?
Well, you move all over the country, basically. I think I served in 7 different Air Force bases in different locations. But initially, you start at a place called RAF College Cranwell, which is in Lincolnshire, so right on towards the east side of the country.
And in Britain, is there a special, connection with flying? You have the Wright brothers, and you have the, connection with America, the first flies across the Atlantic. How does that interact with present day?
I still think we work very closely with the Americans as well, actually. In fact, we work with all of NATO forces as well on different exercises. And I always think, there always is a sort of feeling of pioneering spirit, and certainly coming up with new designs for aircraft types and things like that. So we've still got a very good, manufacturing base for aircraft with British Aerospace, and different companies like Raytheon who do the missile systems. So actually, we still very much are on the developmental side of aviation industry still.
And there's the Rolls-Royce engines, not in the Tornado, but when you think of history in Britain, you think of your fleet, the boats. But how about the history of your planes?
Yeah, well, actually, they are Rolls-Royce engines, actually. So that's what we do have in the Tornado. So, it's been lovely often, well, since I've left and I end up doing talks, and often I'll end up speaking to the likes of Rolls-Royce, and they'll say, oh, what do you think of our engines? I'm like, yeah, they're pretty good. They kept me safe a lot of the time. So, yeah, I mean, exactly. That manufacturing base goes all the way down. It's not just about the aircraft frame, but you're bringing in so many different constitutional parts of industry to create the final product.
And you, how many different countries have you flown in?
Oh, around about 10 probably. I don't want to sit here and count them up, but yeah, probably about 10 different countries.
You were in Canada, for example. Tell us about other different parts of the world where you trained.
One of my favorite places to be was is training out in North America, basically in the Arizona desert. So we go to a place called Nellis Air Force Base, which is just outside Las Vegas. And it's really great because the training out there was replicating the temperature and the desert that we'd be flying on over in the Gulf when the Iraq conflict was going on. And so actually we were training as a coalition. So we would have forces from all over the world that would come together. So I think we had, say, the Swedish Air Force would come, Turkish, French, Canadians, and you're up against, the pilots from America as well. So we'd all be working together on these huge, big coalition missions. And you'd be doing air-to-air combat as well. So you'd have fighters up there. The Americans were the Red Air, the baddies. That really was Top Gunny. And their job was to try to shoot you down, which they were pretty good at. We were often dropping live weapons over there as well. So it was an exciting exercise to be part of. Yeah, it was probably one of my favorite sort of exercises to do.
And which different weapons does the Tornado have, and how many of them have you used?
So it's got lots of different weapons. Well, it doesn't now because it's now out of service, sadly. But at the time, basically, we had different sorts of 1,000-pound bombs. So they're called enhanced paveway bombs. So different sizes of them: 1,000 or 500 pounds, 1,000-pound bombs, 2,000-pound bombs. You have GPS guided weapons, so there's lots of different sort of technicalities as well. They got rid of things like cluster bombs because they were dangerous, ones that were used to explode on the runway because they would form almost like a landmine, which could be potentially dangerous. So those were banned. There's a huge weapon called Storm Shadow, which is a phenomenal weapon that can be dropped, and it literally can go hundreds and hundreds of miles. And there's another one called Brimstone, whereby you would drop the weapon and it would release little bomblets, and they would recognize friendly or enemy different pieces of equipment. So it could be an enemy tank versus a friendly tank, and the Brimstone weapon recognizes that into its software. So some very clever pieces of technology out there now.
And how does a day look like when you're in the Arizona desert, or you're in the base in England training? what does it contain of? You wake up at home, or you live on the base always, or
It
you
depends,
go?
really. I mean, if you're on detachments, you're obviously living on the base or living in a local hotel. But basically, when we're based in the UK, people are allowed to live in their own homes, or some live on base in quarters or in the officer's mess. But every day always starts with a Met brief, meteorological brief, so the weather. And that's often at 8 o'clock in the morning, or if you're on the early wave, it might be 6:30. So you'll always have the Met brief. And whatever state you are in, however tired you are, everyone turns up for the Met brief, whether you're flying or not. And you basically have the brief, which sets the program for the day, who's doing what. You might be on it to fly, you might be doing secondary duties and taskings, and then a cycle of for the day would be set. And basically, even a 2-hour mission, you would have a 2-hour planning cycle for it, 45-minute out brief and walk to the jet, and getting all your kit on. A 2-hour mission, by the time you've come in, got a cup of tea, and then your hour's debrief, you could probably be looking about 6 hours for one flight. So it's quite a lengthy process, and then you fit in all your secondary duties around your flying.
And how many hours do you fly a year?
It depends. It depends how lucky you are. They kept on cutting the hours back, actually, as cuts were hitting the military. And it used to be that you tried to fly around about 18 to 20 hours a month, but that got cut more and more. And I think at some point it got down to about 12 hours a month, which is really not enough flying. If you think that's on average 3 hours a week, that's not enough to keep current. And so, yeah, I think that that becomes a bit more of an issue on currency levels.
And how is it to fly, in real life compared to in a simulator?
Well, the simulators are brilliant, actually. So they're full motion. They've got full screens. You sit in there, you strap into your aircraft, even down to fitting on your G suit and all the equipment. So when you're flying it, it's a brilliant way of practicing what you would do, and at a much, much cheaper cost. So all things like instrument flying, which is how you would land purely by looking at your instruments if the weather was poor. Actually, why not practice that in the simulator? Because rather than trying to replicate it all the time in the air, you can do a lot of that flying on the ground and at a much cheaper cost.
And in the Kuwait War, 7 tornadoes was shot down, and half of them died and half of them were taken as prisoners of war. How was that reality for you?
Yeah, so to be honest, that was 30 years ago. So Gulf War I was 30 years ago now, and in fact 30 years at this moment in time. I think the ceasefire was on the 28th of February, 30 years ago. So there's been a lot going on social media at the moment, sharing people's memories. There's one of the prisoners of war is a guy called John Nichols, and he basically has written lots of books on it. But he's been sharing almost like the daily journey of what was happening throughout the Gulf War I. And, it's incredible really to see, what was going on. But I mean, I was at school at the time, so I knew it was happening, but it didn't really resonate with me as much because I was, playing netball and doing sport and doing what a young girl does at school. So it's only really now reflecting back and knowing, colleagues that have lost their lives that you think, my goodness, it must have been incredible and very scary to be part of that. Yeah.
And you became the squadron's combat survival and rescue officer as well, and instructed on escape and aviation tactics. Tell us about that. Sounds super exciting.
Yeah, I don't know if it's super exciting, but yeah, you do quite a lot of training. So we go to a huge big moor called Dartmoor, and there's a lot of running around, evading troops and soldiers that are trying to catch you, as if you're simulating it that you've ejected over enemy territory. So we learn all the skills for survival, everything from building shelters to building fires that can be, hidden almost, so like a fire under the ground almost. To how to find water, how to find food, all of these skills, and we put them all together. And then also what happens if you ejected over water. So once you've become an instructor in this, you can go back to your squadron, and then you basically are in charge of everyone's currencies and things like that, because you have to do things like water drills of jumping, off the back of a boat that's being pulled along to check, could you get out your parachute and get into your dinghy if you're at sea? So we have to do those every, couple of years, and in a pool every year. So, your role basically is to instruct people once you have the knowledge in how to do that and to maintain currencies. And it becomes more and more relevant when you get out to a war zone, because of course then you are also looking at the escape and evasion plan. If you were to eject in over Iraq, how would you basically escape? How would you evade? And how would you hopefully set up a plan to get you out of there?
And is there a difference, you think, in the education of pilots between different countries, in the US, Britain, Russia, and so on?
Yes and no. I think, you're obviously going to be recruiting similar-minded people, and you know that because whenever you get together in a room full of pilots, they'll generally all get on pretty well, actually. You do see slight differences. I always think the French seem very relaxed, but it's more that they're replicated in their cultural differences, in intrinsically who we are as different nations. I always love working with the Americans, but they are very, very process driven. They're a little bit more earnest, perhaps. You've got the Brits that are very sarcastic, and that just comes across because you're still British or you're still Swedish or French. Just because you're a pilot, you're not going to be changing your culture. But therefore, that does translate ever so slightly in the way that you see them planning their missions and hey, it's fine. The Italians, it's not a problem. So no, it's just different cultures coming together.
And how many fighting pilots are there in Britain active?
I don't know at the moment, Daniel, to be honest. That's not a fact I have to my fingertips, I'm afraid. Sorry.
And in your time, was it like 100 or 1,000 or?
Oh gosh, no, certainly not 1,000. I mean, tornado-wise, you're talking hundreds of pilots, certainly not thousands, and certainly within the fast jet community. I mean, the Tornado, when I was flying it, had 7 squadrons, and you would probably have 20 to 30, so probably about 200 Tornado pilots around that time would be on the front line, and then you would have a Harrier squadrons and also Jaguar squadrons. So I don't know. Realistically, about 500 maybe, but obviously as capabilities change, that's gone down and down and down.
And do you form bonds between you that will last for life, or is it an individualistic occupation?
No, absolutely not. No, it's incredibly high on the camaraderie and the teamwork, and especially the people I knew during training. I think the bond that you create with them is second to none. I'm godmother to quite a few of their children. I'm still very much in touch with all of them as well.
And when you were flying, what's the most traumatic experiences you have had in a tornado?
I got shot at by a surface-to-air missile in Iraq that locked onto my engines, and we managed to evade it by putting out our countermeasures in the form of flares. That was pretty traumatic, but again, there was a lot to be learned from that night. I've had a big bird strike where we hit a huge goose, which was ingested into my engine, and it took out all of my equipment on one side of the aircraft, and we had to do an emergency mayday landing at a Scottish airfield, which I basically had to dive into this airfield, and there was a huge big 747 jumbo jet coming in, and it had to go around for me, and as I leapt into land. So that felt quite powerful. But I was pleased to see the runway. So those are pretty memorable occasions.
And your husband Craig, he's a pilot, Navy pilot originally, and then a commercial pilot. How did you meet, and how is it to share a life with a fellow pilot?
Yeah, I think it's lovely. We met right at the early stages of my career. Craig was one of the instructors going through one of the courses when I was what's called holding, where you're waiting to do a course. And so we got to know each other then. And then we got together after I'd finished the course. And yeah, we always just got on brilliantly. So I literally met him almost on day one of my Air Force career. And, it's been lovely to share my journey and his journey through aviation together. And be able to share our stories because we know what each other's talking about. So, it's lovely to be able to do that as well. And we don't bore each other too much about flying stories particularly, but, at least when he says, oh, I was doing this in the simulator, I can go, oh, really? Oh, that sounds fantastic, so.
And
Yeah.
you have 2 kids now. Did you take them up in the air with you when they were
Uh,
young?
well, actually, I have 4 in total. So I have 2 stepchildren who are wonderful, but they're a bit older now. So Elliot and Francesca. So I took up Elliot flying, actually, which was fantastic. And so of my 4 children, he's the only one I've actually taken flying, which was great. He's now 28. My 25-year-old daughter is just joined the police force, which is fantastic. So she's going through her training. And my 2 sons at this moment in time are not showing much interest in going towards aviation, which is a shame. But you never know. We can hold our fingers, keep our fingers crossed that they might change their minds at some point.
And when people think about flying, they think about danger, but I guess it's more dangerous to drive a car.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How many, turns around the globe have you flown, you think? And how do you experience the danger of it compared to being on ground? Do you
Yeah,
feel safer up there?
Yeah, you're very procedurally driven. So of course there's always going to be an element of risk, but there is an element of risk in everything that we do when we get out of bed in the morning. Perhaps not so much at the moment because we're not allowed out because we're in lockdown. But yeah, it's an odd one really. I've never felt particularly scared to be airborne. You're trusting in the systems, you're trusting in the aircraft and in the team around you. It's not. I wouldn't say it's a dangerous career. It's obviously going to be more risky than some other careers, for example, working in an office. Of course it is. But with that comes excitement, challenge, and this wonderful experience. So, there we are.
And do you build your body along the way? Do you, when you finish the Air Force, do you have a strong body that will last for 100 years, or are you worn out?
I hope so. Well, actually, having said that, I did have to have back surgery, but now I'm obviously I'm invincible. I'm like Wonder Woman now. But no, I think you just keep yourself fit. I certainly don't think it wears your body out. No, I just think generally you're of a mindset whereby you want to keep a healthy body and healthy mind.
And your husband was a Navy pilot. How is it to land on ships compared to land, on regular airfields and different parts of landing throughout the world?
So he's only ever landed helicopters on ships, actually, which is still pretty challenging. Yeah. I've always preferred, quite frankly, a concrete runway that's not moving myself.
And can you land, if you have to rescue land, so to say, can you land on sand or in a field or
no,
tundra or?
No, not in a fast jet. You have to land on a runway. It's too heavy. In a small aeroplane, like a propeller aeroplane, if you have an emergency in a propeller aeroplane, like a training aircraft, the sort of aircraft that people fly for their private pilot's licenses, then they can land in fields or on sand, because they're a much lighter aircraft. But no, the Tornado's a pretty heavy beast.
And you became a keynote speaker. You took all your knowledge and were able to pass it along. Now you help companies and schools and such. Tell us about what's lessons you give to others now from the life you lived.
So what's really nice is that the way we are as human beings is that our brains, we learn and we remember through storytelling. So if you give someone a whole load of facts and figures, they don't remember them. But if we hear a story, that's how we pass on information from generation to generation. And so my whole philosophy is that I share the stories of my time in the Air Force, of my journey to get to it, of resilience and determination to overcome challenges in process and protocols, but also utilizing the team around you. There's so many wonderful stories on leadership and stress management and decision making under pressure. And they're all so relevant to business. But so long as you share it in the context of a story, people can remember that. And therefore, when they're thinking about doing something, they relate to it later on. And so I often get people telling me and regaling stories that they've heard me tell. When I started my career 8 years ago, they said, "Oh, the story that you told about cycling, with your team." And I say, "My goodness, it's amazing how well people remember them." So it's lovely to be able to share that.
And which is the best story you have shared?
I share a story actually which always gets quoted to me, which is about a young girl when I left the Air Force, I signed up as a volunteer, and I would fly cadets. So it's how I started, and it's basically lovely to be able to pass on that love of flying to the next generation. And she was a 14-year-old girl that seemed quite surly and a little bit classic teenage, grunting. And I flew with her, and she turned out to be one of the most natural pilots I've ever met. And, I said to her, I think you're really talented. And she just said, oh, but you say it to everyone. And then I said, no, you really are good. And suddenly her whole body language changed. And she suddenly said to me, actually, this is all I've ever wanted to do my whole life. And I was so scared I was going to fail that I decided to basically not show you that I was interested and not try, because in my own brain, I decided that if I didn't try, I could always blame it on that. And I think it was just such a good life lesson for all of us that, we are open to that, and we all fear this failure in some way where we back away from things. Whereas if we don't grab opportunities with both hands and try things, we never know what we're going to be really great at. And it also linked into when I was a young girl, because once I had flown, I then had a sense of purpose and a sense of drive that I'd been lacking perhaps up to that point. And I think for herself, suddenly she clicked as to why she was going through school, because now she needed to gain a certain qualification to become a pilot. And so things start to come into place when we have purpose. It then enables us to have resilience when things don't go well, because we want to achieve a goal. And so it brings together all of the aspects of self-belief, about passing on a belief or a love of something to the next generation, and actually encouraging people to be the very best versions of themselves.
Mm. And which were your biggest flaws as a pilot? Did you have anything left, to improve?
You always have everything to improve. Yeah, you're never a finished product. But yeah, I just think, there's nothing specific particularly, but, you can always try to be better.
And how can you compare different pilots side by side? Do you do like Top Gun challenges
Yeah. We would do bombing competitions where it would be like working as a team, precision bombing on the range. So you would drop weapons and you would get scores about how far they are from the target. So we would do that sort of thing. But also, generally, there are people that you could consider to be a much better pilot than others. And of course, you're flying with a navigator or weapon systems operator in the back seat. And it's just an interesting one, because they would also go, oh, no, they're a really good pilot. Ooh, not quite so good. And a lot of it's often around that decision making, situational awareness, or also we call it just a good set of hands, which means they're just a really good operator of the jet. So, there's lots of different things that determine whether someone's a better pilot than others.
And how much is the machine and how much is the pilot?
Probably 50-50, really. I mean, if you think about it, though, everyone's got the same machine. So actually, the only thing that would determine who would be a better pilot would be the actual skill set of the pilot involved and their capabilities, basically. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that the aircraft today are helping pilots with their awareness because of technology, but still, you still need to have a very high level of skill to be able to fly.
And when you do, when you fly in games and such, AI and the Xbox, and there's a lot of things that, the driven technology. Does fighting pilots bring something to society? What's developed there can then, be used in society, or is it the other way around, that they implement stuff from
a little bit of both, really. Basically, helping anyone's hand-to-eye coordination is always going to help. Creating good decision making is going to help. So I think there's going to be a bit of both ways.
And do you have psychologists and such and train the mind to be strong as well? Do you do like visualization and?
No, they don't tend to do too much of that, actually, which is a shame. Well, they certainly didn't in my day. I don't know if they do now.
Mm-hmm. And looking to the future, how do you think fighting pilots and education and the planes will develop in the coming decades from now?
I think you're going to see more of a combination, basically, of unmanned vehicles and manned vehicles. And what you might see is that perhaps formations going off with one pilot in a piloted aircraft, but there being a formation of 8 aircraft that are all being flown by as drones. So things like that, you're going to start to see more and more looking at utilizing those drones and unmanned aerial vehicles definitely in the workplace.
And if you were to become a philosopher and write, a chapter about the very essence of being a fighting pilot, what would that be?
I think it would be about being at one with your aircraft. I think it would be about the enabling of seeing yourself as part of a bigger picture, be it as a team or be it as part of a formation of aircraft. And yeah, I just think it's about the coming together of a huge amount of skill sets to create, overall just the best experience that you can possibly have.
And
you can tell I'm not.
And different seasons. Does it change much to fly in winter time compared to summer, heat compared to minus degrees?
Yeah, very much so. Because of course, as the air changes temperature, it changes its density. So in the summer and hot, high temperatures, it takes longer to get airborne, for example. In cold temperatures, you've got to wear an immersion suit to fly, and so it takes a lot longer to get into your kit. It's a very different experience flying in all the different seasons.
And have you been able to take lessons from your life as a fighting pilot to your everyday life now in decision making and stress management and such?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite mantras is control the controllables, and if you can't, let it go. So, it's a case of managing what you can and don't stress over the things that you can't. So there's loads of different things that I use in my everyday life still.
And your parents, what's the greatest lessons you learned from them?
My mum always basically said to me, if it's going to be someone, why shouldn't it be you? And I think that's a lovely way to look at it, is that I'd done as much as I possibly could, and it was up to me now to basically get in and do the best that I could do. They always say, if you don't try, you don't know what you can achieve. And it's a case of that, isn't it? If you don't buy a lottery ticket, you're never going to win the lottery.
And now you're an avid sports. You play tennis and you do cycling and hill walking and such. Which sports do you think are similar to being a fighting pilot? Is it tennis where you have to playing tennis with 2 rackets and 2 balls, perhaps?
Probably skiing. Probably skiing's the closest you're going to get, because you get the experience of the speed. Probably that's the closest you'll get, and that's how I get my thrills now. Fast up the hill.
Fast up the hill. Mandy, warm thank you and the best of luck now on your journey towards the future and through the air and on land.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And if anyone would be interested in reading my book, are you happy for me to do a plug for it?
Absolutely.
So I do have a copy here. So basically, it's a wonderful book called An Officer, Not a Gentleman, and it's available on Amazon. So if anyone is interested in reading the inspirational journey of a pioneering pilot, then there you go.
Fantastic. We look forward to that.
Lovely.
Well, thank you, Mandy.
So much. Great to meet you, Daniel.